So I want to share something beginning to the time when I first went in Zambia, which was 35 years ago. And to me, going to Zambia was a bit of a shock. I hadn't been prepared. My time in England had not prepared me for the reality of Africa. And this is a problem that I think we in mission continue to face. You get a lot of information when you're in the UK, but it really doesn't prepare you very well regarding what's actually going on in Africa on the ground. A gap that's not reflected in the literature or the glossy magazines or the stories. Well, to some extent it is reflected in the stories, but yet in other ways it's concealed. My introduction to Africa, some of you may have said this before, when I got to the little airport we had at the mission station, they said, well, what's he doing here? Pointing to me, because the important people were going to the hospital. Oh, he's going to the secondary school. And no one at the secondary school seemed to know I was coming. So they found there was an African teacher. He had 3-bedroom house, so let's take him there. And he swept a room for me. And there I was in this Zambian person's house. Now, it was a mission station house, but he was the one living in it. Not the done thing. The done thing is when there's a missionary from the Western country, you put them living with another Western missionary. There was his niece cooking, sitting on the floor. Now, my mum will say, I got very thin in my 3 years in Zambia as I endeavored to associate myself, let's say, closely with the indigenous ways of life. When it's very tempting and very normal as a Western person to kind of maintain your own foundation and then kind of make trips into the indigenous rather than existing in the indigenous. It was kind of unthinkable in Zambia at the time. Maybe things have changed for a white person from Europe to, say, live with African people in African context. Now, what exactly does that mean? Of course, there's a fuzzy edges here. Typically, though, what happens when there's an interracial marriage is that the African person comes into a Western way of life rather than the other way around. So my interest was to say, does this really have to be such a strong dividing line? And my orientation since then continues in 30 years in Kenya to be there's something important to learn and to know by moving closer to the indigenous people. And doing so, in a sense, I can say, draws immense opposition. In theory, I think people like the idea. In practice, it makes your head go funny. If you spend a lot of time with African people using their language in indigenous context, you cease to think properly as white people should. And you cease to communicate properly, perhaps, as white people should. So yes, ironically, there's opposition often, seems to me, arising from misunderstanding. In other words, like when I was doing missionary training, the training said you should learn the language and be close to the people, but no one there had done it. So when I had done it, it still was hard for them to take on board what I was saying. I thought about a phrase here, looking over one's shoulder. You know, if you're going somewhere, perhaps a plowman is a bit of a biblical example, but you're on a journey and you're a little bit concerned, are there still people following me? What do? You look over your shoulder. Missionaries look over their shoulders a lot. Why? Because the important people are the ones behind you who sent you, not the ones you're reaching. Because the ones you're reaching, in terms of Africa, typically have little voice, little money, they're to be reached. But the people who control are back in the West. So missionaries are very careful to keep looking over their shoulder. Now, I think it's important to look over one's shoulder because my relationship with you folks and folks like yourselves in Germany and elsewhere in the UK is very important. But there comes a point where you can be spending almost all your time looking over your shoulder and you have very little time to engage actually the people you should be reaching. So I guess that's a way of introducing the kind of, I don't know an easy solution, but there's a dilemma. The people who provide the funds, how much should they be controlling what's happening? When should they pull the rug? When should they tell you, no, this is wrong, when they don't understand the context? Or should they just keep writing blank checks every year, regardless of what you're doing? Certainly, as a missionary dependent on regular funding from the West, one feels the pressure all the time, and not only I do. I mean, people spend lots of time making sure things look good over there. And particularly if you've taken the step of allowing yourself to become vulnerable to the indigenous people and realizing that your way of thinking and functioning and everything else is going to shift. You think, goodness, am I really going to be able to convince people back at home again that what I'm doing makes sense? And you just hope that those who you've known for a long time might think, well, he was serious when he started. He seems a bit crazy now, but perhaps we don't understand, but he's still doing God's work. So that ongoing link with those people who knew you well, let's say when you're younger, seems to be particularly important. Maybe I can say that many missionaries like to do it clean. Clean is the term that came to mind. Now, clean is basically, you're in the UK functioning like a Brit, you transfer yourself to another part of the world like Africa, and you continue really to function like a Brit. So that when you get a visitor and they come to your home, they see the things that they're familiar with back in the UK. And you have a vehicle to pick them up from the airport, and you have a flush toilet, and you have the facilities and the guard and the security fence around so that they can feel at home. Now, I don't belittle that. That's standard procedure, because if you don't do that, visitors kind of dry up. It's the common thing. So you're a missionary because you are there, and because you have time, you reach to those people, perhaps on a frequent or daily basis, but you retreat back into a context that's very Western, British, American, whatever it is. Now, I'm kind of giving you some clues here that I put that model aside. I remember meeting a lady who was a politician in Kenya once, well-known, almost celebrity, and he's at a funeral, and I went to talk to her, and she said to me something like, we have to help these poor people. She was a Kenyan. She was a Luo. We have to help these poor people. I was a bit taken aback, but you're one of them. No, she isn't, of course. She's a very wealthy person. But what I noticed was legitimate, acceptable discourse, formally, in Kenya, imitates Britain. If you want to be listened to properly in Africa, you talk like as if you are Brit or American. That's the standard. If you're someone who's like in the upper crust, or a journalist, or an academic, all the work is done as if someone is positioning themselves with the West. So that's the model which I struggled against. As I said, no, we need to understand who people are and where they're coming from. Nowadays, I'm under the Coptic Orthodox Church. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Our bishop recently came and said to me, Jim, I wish I could do what you're doing, but I can't. The bishop has loads of responsibilities. He's spending $1 million or not on this project, people calling him, traveling all over the world, and so on. But he recognizes that by putting all those budget items aside, I'm enabled to draw close to the people in a way that he can't. And he recognizes the value in that. As I see value in that, because it begins to enable me to communicate with African people as if almost I'm one of them, rather than from the British Western perspective. No one seems to know Africa. It's very striking to me, going back to Zambia, but the thing is, in Zambia, I work particularly closely with American and British missionaries, and the way Americans and Brits were thinking about things was so vastly different to the way that the Zambians themselves were doing so, but the missionaries didn't seem to notice. That was my impression. All formal engagement, of course, was in English. Whenever you praise the African people, how well they're doing, it's because they're able to do it the way we do it. You don't praise them for doing their own things well. You praise them because, oh, look, he knows mathematics. He knows English. He can preach like a white person can preach, and so on. And at the end of the day, the Europeans often remain in charge. Now, I say all that to say, in a sense, that's not where I am. I don't know if there's a question someone wants to ask at this point before I go on. Yes. Right. I was an agriculturalist, basically. So I assumed that my knowledge that I'd picked up in college could help me to educate the people to grow more food. And they definitely seemed to need that. And then barriers that I didn't know could exist kept on raising themselves as I engaged that, difficulties came out of nowhere, and it became extremely difficult to actually fulfill that, even though it looked so easy at the beginning. Okay, so let's look at the projector here then. So we have two people. We have African people and we have Western people who up till 100 or 150 or 200 years ago were living distinct lives in distinct parts of the world. Now, these days, they've been brought very much together by globalization, travel, air transport, and so on and so forth. Now, when you bring African and Western people together, of course, there's a lot that we all have in common. And that's here represented in this Venn diagram by the grey area. But there's also something that African people have and do which is different from what we Western people have and do, which I here represent in yellow. Things unfamiliar to those of us living in the UK. What are those things? Shh. Secret. They're not supposed to be there. They're not supposed to be there. You can't really explain them in English. And when you say these things about your African colleagues, if they know what the global discourse is, they might feel offended, because these are things that are not supposed to be happening. So all that together results in this African content kind of becoming fuzzy and grey and even invisible, not supposed to exist to the African people themselves, because if they draw on it in public circles, they just look like they're foolish. So that part of who they are kind of goes out of sight. Now, there's also things, of course, that we Western people have and do and think, which is unlike what the African people have and do and think, and which I've here represented in blue. Now, this also, that to us seems rock solid, at least when you're just come out of school it does. When you get a bit older, the kind of British diet, you realize it's got actually flaws all through it. But when you're, as I was when I went to Zambia, 24 years old, out of school, know a lot, let's take it to the people, looked pretty solid. But of course the African people weren't reared on that. Now, even if they went to school on that, because the schooling system in much of Africa works, well, all of Africa really, on European languages, so in theory they pick up what we picked up. Now in practice, they don't do so very well. They have to do rote learning. So then on both sides, you get this fuzzy nature of what's going on. Now, the middle is also a bit fuzzy, but let's not look at that, be too worried about that now. Just to add, of course, what is Western affects what is happening in Africa, and what is African affects what's happening in the West. So you get the blue on the African side and the yellow on the Western side. Now, this is the way that movement is expected to happen. And I've kind of indicated this. There's always expectation that people will shift to become more Western, more British, more American, less African. Not bad. I don't think it's the wrong orientation. You might ask, well, what actually is this yellow that I'm representing on the African side that I've said is like embarrassing to explain? Well, you have to accept if I try and explain it, then it might seem like I'm trying to embarrass somebody. And of course, in brief, only simplifying, but a great deal of it, let's say, is a means to bring peace that sheds blood. A means that brings peace, healing, fertility, progress, victory, wealth that sheds blood. That I can suggest is this content that is found over on the African side that the West does not have. Now, if you think actually we should become more like Africans, well, we have this romantic sort of thinking that's around, like the noble savage. I'm afraid I don't find it very accurate. Basically, all the world says the white man leads the way, everyone should follow. That raises the question, how do you get there? If that's the case, how do you get there? Now, if you don't like it being the case, and in order to be politically correct, perhaps you shouldn't like it to be the case, but in reality, it's happening all the time. And it's like an unstoppable steam engine. So if you want to say, no, they shouldn't be like us, well, maybe you're even more out of date than I am. But here's what I want to suggest. And it's becoming more and more clear to me what brings people. How have we come to be who we are that we value today? Now, there's lots of bad things around today, but those bad things themselves have often been enabled by something that we discovered that God taught us, which is, in simple terms, you no longer need to shed blood in order to prosper if you keep your eyes on the cross of Christ, because his blood has been sufficient for us. And this is where people struggled, and they still struggle. I mean, there's many. It's funny, I'll come back to this later, but when I'm in UK, Africa changes, because the discourse in UK cannot accept the way things are. But there are many folks functioning who still know that in order to bring healing, you have to shed blood. So every time someone dies, someone has killed them in order to benefit somebody else. So you wonder who killed them. And whenever there's a problem of health or fertility or failure in business, then the same solution is being sought. Somehow you need to attack somebody else, get someone else's blood in order to rectify your own situation. How do we get out of that trap? Because I think our forefathers were in the same trap. That's what seems to have been the case. Well, by sufficient focusing on the cross of Christ, because Christ died for us. His blood was shed. And his blood that was shed once is reshed. Now, I don't know if that's good theology. Pardon me, I'm not a Western theologian. Every time we open the scriptures broadly, every time we have the Holy Communion, more specifically. Now, of course, if you're in the Orthodox or Catholic tradition, every time you have the Mass and the bread becomes a body of Christ, and you draw on the blood of Christ. And that blood of Christ releases you from the bondage to the violence that was inherent to life in those old days. Nevertheless, we have this problem that remains. In theory, this is... Oh, here's a point to look. This is like who the African is, like us. So we treat them the same as we do fellow Brits, and not to do so is being racist. Now, one of my books looks very much at this theme. There's no copies here, unfortunately. If I have some, I failed to find them today. So in theory, of course, it isn't actually a race issue, it's a culture issue. The culture issues have all gone, and whatever Africans are in Europe, they're like this, when actually they're much more like this. They are still who they are. These things that people once were still are there. And much of life revolves around it. And particularly in the church is busy dealing with this, the African churches. They're always up against this and dealing with it. So it tends to set the pace. It's not gone. And then also we need to remember that this modernity, or whatever you want to call it, that we think is so wonderful and so straightforward and simple, a lot of folks struggle to get what it really is. So there's some kind of theoretical introduction. I don't know, if people tell me, I don't know, you might not understand how I think. I don't know how you think anymore either. It's quite, when I was thinking to myself the other day, I enjoy expounding God's word, but I don't know how I can do it in Britain, because you just don't understand what you need to know in order to understand God's word. Sorry, Don. The same kind of thing that we tend to say to African people. How can you understand God's word correctly unless you are like us? So, how is the above described confusion rendered visible? So, some examples. Well, here's one, which I've already alluded to, which is a personal one. And I guess many of these things are personal because I'm the one experiencing them. When I come to UK, Kenya ceases to be the way it is. Now, in the past, I used to come for 4 months or more. It was hard work because it was like you Brits were putting Kenya away, getting rid of it. And I went back and there it was. It's still there. But it became more and more difficult to believe what's actually happening in Africa the longer I stayed in Britain. Because you, general British, you don't accept it. It's beyond what you can live with. So you kind of try and get rid of it. Now, an example here. Visitors came from Norwich some years ago, and we went to this African village. And the old men were sitting down. They gave us a room next door where we were going to be sleeping or something. And they were talking about what was going on. And they were saying, you must have at least 2 or 3 wives. Otherwise, if your wife dies, you're really in trouble. But what they forgot was that I was able to hear their language. So later, and I went in discussion, I said, well, you were just saying that 2 or 3 wives is better than 1. How did you know? I wasn't supposed to have heard that. Yeah, they know that's a discourse they keep to themselves. And it's not one that Westerners can cope with. Increasingly, I guess they can't, because it implies so many things about male and female that when I say you, I mean, I don't know you personally, but you Brits, as a collective, and the way you present yourselves around the world through the BBC, as being, I don't need to go into the gender issues that are live these days. Life being a series of funerals. It was quite ironic. I was recently spent just over 2 months in Tanzania. Wonderful thing about Tanzania, Swahili can be used everywhere. So once you know Swahili, you can move in every corner and still be understood. The first Luo people I met after 2 months away, going near the border with Kenya, because there's Luo in Tanzania, using their own language, talking about funerals. It just blew my mind. I heard very little about funerals in Swahili. Now back in Luo, the topic was, this person died, we're going to bury. Funerals are everything, constant, around my home area. You don't talk about other things. It's interesting, just in a few weeks in Britain, people talk about all kinds of things, which kind of seem to be of no interest if you're concerned for the dead and the dying. So racial equality. We strive for interracial equality. Whatever part of the world you've come from, you're equally valuable for God. Yes, don't deny that at all. Equally competent at functioning in a secular community. That doesn't make sense around our way. We know, we Africans, blacks, when a white person shows up, they're more clever, they're more competent, they come from a wealthy place, they're powerful, and they are considerate. Because as I said, we Africans thrived by killing. You have got round that somehow. Now, of course, you haven't. You're still killing. Look at Ukraine. But what one has to remember in a sense is, if you can get round the killing on a small scale, you can kill on a large scale. But if you never get away from killing your neighbor or the next village, you don't get to our big wars like Ukraine and Russia. So we haven't solved it, but in a sense, at a particular level, we have. So what about if equality was the other way around? Instead of, look, we must treat everyone as if they're the same as us. What about if the basis was African? So when you go, Don came to Kenya. My mum recently came. A few people here have visited. Instead of being privileged as a white man, he's forced to be like an African. Equality. Equality. Yeah? So when you're in Africa, be an African. Not many whites want that because they like the fact that their £1 English currency buys them a lot. And they know how to run the computer and they know how the economy operates and they land on top. So when we talk about equality as Brits, we're actually saying we're on top. You can be on top like us if you recognize that we're the best. It's actually not very humblifying. Now we say that's also not being racist. Treat other people as if they're like us. So we're the bee's knees. We're the ones that count. If everyone was like us, the world would be a better place. Who are you? Where does God come into this? Yeah, he's had an influential part, but these days, again, when I say you're members of a church, you're worshipping Jesus, but the Western world isn't known for that. It's known for its secularism, let me say. So, before I go on, anything anyone wants to mention on what I've shared? Or have you all got a headache?
I do have one question. Were you born in Africa or England?
I was born in England, yeah. Up to age 24, I was in England and Germany. Well, we'll have more time for questions later. Just to say, this is a book that many people recommend is the one. Peter says this. If you're going to read one book and find out what Jim's about, this is the one. And it's a novel, so it's not all academic. Most of my books are very academic. That's the arena in which I found I can function. I guess it's some kind of God's gifting, is by writing academic texts. So just to say a bit more about what I kind of get up to. This is actually my home church annual conference, I think in August in Kisumu, near my home. So probably in no particular order, but theological education oriented to indigenous churches using Luo and Swahili languages. I think this is my prime ministry, in which I visit a whole variety of churches, and we have churches everywhere. You know, if this was Bridge Street in Kenya, there would be about 5 churches from the roundabout to here, on the side of the road. We have churches everywhere. Let's say, again, always simplifying, but there's truth in it, that's how people know to organize themselves away from killing witches. If you follow your instincts and the traditions of your people to bring people together, you're going to find a witch to accuse, and you're going to argue and fight and get drunk. Now, of course, the gospel doesn't make us into angels, but it brings people together incredibly. So not only Kenya, Tanzania, I mean, I hear the same in Nigeria and Ghana and South Africa. the African people are absolutely in favor of the Bible and of the gospel and of the church because it's what they have. And it works. Brings people together in all kinds of ways, enables functioning peacefully, never completely. No, don't misunderstand me, like British churches. I know you have good churches, but they have issues all the time. But it brings people together. Mind-blowing. Now, connected to this, prayer for the sick, pastoral visiting, developing relationships with local leaders, and so on. So that's one aspect of the ministry I'm engaged in. Looking after orphan children. Currently I have 8 at my home. I've done this for a long time, always informally. Why informally? Well, many reasons. One being that if a local grandmother takes in somebody and looks after them, she just does it in a local way. But if you are going to do this in a formal way, the standard is now Britain or Germany. And you need this running water, you need security, you need a social worker employed. Every child must have their own bed in a place that's built in this way. In other words, as soon as you go the formal route, you set yourself apart from the rest of the people. You become now, you're the white person doing your thing in the special way. Other people carry on doing their thing in the informal way, and you've put a gap between you. So in order to stay close to the people, I follow the local way. Now, my home, probably we have more food security than other homes, but we're not so different. Those who've visited me, Janet and Yvonne came many moons ago. Peter was there. Peter was there, of course. I think my home is built by an African for him and his 2 wives, and it's really like another home. So the children are not brought to Europe to be raised, but they're raised within their own context. Writing research, helping Westerns to understand Africa and to comprehend the damage they easily do. I'll put it that way. Now there is Frank Paul. Some of folks here know him, one of my colleagues, who worked in Argentina. In other words, there are many people around the world who have this same orientation to saying we shouldn't be controlling people in order to reach them, but we should reach them as they are by becoming vulnerable to them. So he's one of the people very much also promoting this message. I was previously, in formal sense, under Church of God, Anderson, Indiana, in the US. This is where they're headquartered. I was with them for 18 years, teaching theology at their American kind of Bible college. Again, that was about 10 miles from where I'm living. But since 2012, let's say, the Coptic Orthodox Church that happens to have a mission station 7 miles from home has brought me under their wing. And increasingly, I'm not Coptic, and I do visit their churches and enjoy the liturgy, but I don't actually take the Mass. I'm not actually a member of the Coptic Church, but involved with them in different ways, preaching, leading Bible studies, prayer for the sick, orienting their new missionaries, being a friend, is how I sum that up. Fifthly, every year now for a number of years, I've spent 1 or 2 months in Tanzania and worked particularly at colleges for Mennonite churches, Church of God, which is a bit like Methodist, Brethren churches, Bible college teaching in Tanzania. That's kind of what I'm engaged in doing. What should a missionary do with respect to equality? Now, I want us to look at the scriptures. I'm going to do it quite quickly. Don't think, please, this is the way I teach when I'm in Kenya. I don't have projectors, just the Bible. And I don't know. If I say you reach Kenyans emotionally, or Tanzanians, but the Brits just kind of sit there and look at you, I think you recognize that's a feature of us. We don't kind of express emotions. Many of my African colleagues, their stated objective seems to be to get everyone on their knees crying at the front, and usually they succeed. I'm not so good at that. So we want this equality, neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, no male or female. We strive for equality. Romans 2:11, God shows no partiality. And that really grates with us when we see how partial the world is, how privileged we see ourselves as being. And even today, people are talking about, oh, we in the UK, we're so privileged. We have all this food, we have all this money, and all this depression, maybe all this suicide, and all this drunkenness, all this use of drugs, and all these people who can't even be content with being a man or woman. They have to change. Sometimes this self-praise is how we're so wonderful. Life is a bit more complex than that. I mean, the one thing I sometimes see in Kenya, people surrounded by family, when we're so often families sprayed all over the place, loneliness, etc., etc. Anyway, no partiality. Love your neighbor as yourself. Great. And we should love our neighbor as ourselves. So if I'm a Brit and a neighbor comes from a distant land, love him as myself. Now, if that is taken up by the media and by scholarship and on TV and radio, then my standard becomes a standard everywhere. So the African person is expected to look after the host the way I would in Britain. And their own ways become more and more shady, as I've said. That's kind of the problem. Neither Jew nor Greek, Galatians 3:26-29. Slave nor free, no male and female, you're one in Christ Jesus. These are powerful verses which are important verses for us to take account of when we relate to our neighbours near and far. When a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. In the Old Testament. And indeed, if you follow through the history of the Jewish people, of course historians always argue, but you see the profound difference in the way the Jews lived compared with their neighbours. Because partly from their experience, of course, in Exodus, they treat the stranger, let's say, much more as a brother, whereas other people treat him as a witch. Revolutionary teachings and important teachings. When you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you'll be blessed, because they cannot repay you. James 2:1-2, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, I don't know the British context so well. I think, say, we struggle with this because particularly when it's coming up to election time, many politicians get their audience in the church. Many. They can't pull a crowd otherwise unless you have a lot of money to give out. But the church has got them a preformed congregation. They come along, they want to speak, and then when they finish speaking, they'll put their hand in their pocket and give a donation to the church. So it's tempting to have them sit at the front because they can help us complete our projects. And that's generally what we do. We don't just let the politicians sit at the back and ignore them. You give them the prime place, something that here seems to be contradicted. Whatever you wish that others would do to you, you also do to them. This is the law and the prophets. Now, how do we do this? This is the way it seems to be done. Donations. We dig wells, facilitate education, provide for hospitals, advise, fund, teach English. Control. Control. And maybe this is the illustration that came to my mind, how we control. If we think that other parts of the world live the same as we do, I think we're deceiving ourselves. Again, I'm talking about Africa, Asia, who knows, I'm not familiar with. But we have all these reserves and means of having a surplus, and we want to help Africa. And who controls the flow? Well, as I say, the missionaries always got to be looking behind to make sure that if they're dependent on that money, they keep going. Well, the African people are the same. They're also always having to look, we must please the white man or we'll be in trouble. It might not have much to do with truth, but they've got to do it because we try and control. We know better. We have responsibility for money. You can't give money without being responsible for it. So you can't, in that sense, you have to control what's going on. But is control really the way forward? How did Jesus do this? Some people talk about orthopraxy and orthodoxy. So we have those teachings. How did Jesus work with people? Did he raise funds in Rome so as to give them out to widows in Israel? Well, no, not really. He multiplied bread, but through prayer. There's no indication there was a project involved there. He used their language. I don't think he introduced a foreign language because this was the language of civilization, for example. He lived with people according to their own resources. praying for the sick. Again, I'm not saying hospitals are wrong. I mean, you'd shoot me if I did. And they save a lot of people and they improve the quality of life. But they're also a big problem because, again, it puts the white man always at the top and the local person is always ignorant. Now, in my case, Egyptians at the top. They get it much more than do the Africans. So there's these dilemmas in the modern way of treating the sick. Jesus prayed for the sick. He cast out demons and he died. Is death success or is it failure? Well, of course, for Christ it was success. And if we follow Christ, then for us it should be success. And if death itself is success, the closer you get to it, the more you've succeeded. For whoever will save his life will lose it, and whoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. Says Matthew 16:25-26. So our objective in relating to our brothers and sisters is to lose our lives. Paul showing off, maybe showing off or just telling how much he's faced death in his various missionary exploits. Just going to the end, I've known hunger and thirst, often gone without food, I've been cold and naked. This was kind of rubber stamping his apostolic authority. The struggles he'd gone to. John 12:24. Verily, very truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. It's, again, I'm kind of stating it rather than elaborating on it. But do we even realize that even this place here, we have different names in East Africa, like we call it synagogue. It's not synagogue. The altar, where the preacher stands, that's the place of murder. This is where murder happens. That's why we respect the preacher and where he stands, the priest and what he does. Death, in many senses, is a beginning of holiness. So this is the biblical theology, the theology of death. And as I've already indicated, it speaks volumes to Africa because they know the only way forward is to kill. I mean, the tradition, of course, if this is one village and they have 20 cows, and this is another village and they have 25 cows, how are they going to get more cows? Well, they come and steal your cows. And if anyone gets in the way, they kill them. That's the way you get on. So if in those days you said, do not steal, they said, hey, you telling us to be poor forever. We want to steal, we want to progress. Some people call it limited good worldview. Christ transformed that. And we should follow in his steps.